Well, thanks for having me, Ann Arbor District Library, and everyone in Ann Arbor. And thanks for being here, Miranda. Miranda is a professor, I don't know the full title, at the University of Michigan, and she specializes in Chinese studies. And we have known each other for decades now, because we were in grad school together in Berkeley. So it's a pleasure to have her here as my conversation partner, too.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited. So maybe, shall I ask you to start?
Okay. I'm not sure how many people here actually know about Pei-mei. Do you all raise your, oh, okay, so a pretty good show of hands here. If you don't know who she is like the Julia Child of Chinese cooking, is what the New York Times called her. So she was on television in Taiwan for 40 years. She wrote dozens of cookbooks. She traveled the world. She had a cooking school. She taught Chinese cooking to all kinds of people all around the world. And yeah, I decided to basically write a book about her because this is a cookbook. If you know it, it's bilingual, so it's in Chinese and in English, and it's a cookbook that I grew up with. So it's because a lot of the, when people would come from Taiwan and come to the United States to study, Pei-mei's cookbook is one of the things they would bring in their suitcase with them, because everyone was so homesick for, the taste of Chinese cuisine. And so they wanted to learn how to make it. And so that's kind of one of her big claims to fame. Yeah, so that's kind of a basic introduction to who she is, but I'm happy to answer other questions.
Okay, so am I audible? All right, thank you. I guess I'll start with a very basic question, because I was, a number of years ago, I was flipping through Gastronomica, and I saw your name, and I saw Pei-mei, and I was excited because I had gotten her, I had remembered seeing her on television as a child, but also I think someone sent me her 2-volume book when I got married as a wedding present. And so I was like, wow, Michelle, I didn't know you were doing food, but I'm also just kind of curious, have you used her cookbook? And I mean, I guess I know that you used to see the book in your mom's shelf when you were little, but I've actually just been curious about whether you, how have you used the cookbook as something other than a primary source?
So I did, when I was on my mom's cookbook shelf, and my mom is here tonight as well, also visiting. So, yeah, long time resident of Michigan. Yeah. So besides looking through the cookbook as a kid, when I first, when I went to college, I ate in the cafeteria, the dorm cafeteria. And it wasn't until I went to study abroad in Germany that I had to start cooking for myself, right? Then I'm really fending for myself, living on my own, and, really having to cook. And so I remember calling my mom from a payphone in Germany saying, "Mom, how do I cook that eggplant?" Because I had bought eggplant and tried to cook it, and it came out as brown gloop. And I was like, this is terrible. I don't know how to, I'm imagining purple, glistening, beautiful eggplant with garlic and, looks beautiful. And I didn't get that when I made it. So I remember calling her, and at that time, when I was in college, my mom said, "Hey, why don't you try using Pei-mei's cookbooks?" Because that's how she got started with Chinese cooking. So when I got my own copy of the book or whatever, I started with, I think it was beef and peppers or something like that. But I probably didn't have peppers, or she sent me the recipe or something for beef and peppers. And I remember sort of learning some basics about how to cook different dishes, and then I started making a sweet and sour chicken dish or something like that. So at that time I used her cookbooks, and then, but not intensively or anything like that. It really wasn't until later, again, after I had my own kids, that once again, I was really wanting to cook Chinese food for my own children, because it was really important to me that they learn to eat Chinese food and not just say, "I won't eat that," or, "I can't use chopsticks." I really wanted them to kind of enjoy and appreciate Chinese food. And so I was looking through her cookbooks again as an adult. And that's when I thought, there's all these pictures in here of all these, her meeting all these VIPs, and newspaper clippings about her, all her escapades and everything like that. And so that's when I thought, oh, this might make a book. or this might be something I could investigate. So, because by then I had already trained as a gender historian. And so I knew that I wanted a topic that could really center women's experiences and women's lives. So that was my main drive in wanting to write about a cookbook author. And, because her main audience at first was housewives. And then, women had all kinds of responses and experiences in using her cookbooks as well.
Okay, so let me ask you. So I never got a chance to do this, but I know that you interviewed her daughter, Angela Chung. So I guess my first question would be: did Angela? I know Angela teaches at a teaching school that I attended for a while in Taiwan, and I've always been very curious what you thought of her food. Are we being recorded? And I mean. Yeah, so I'll start with that. Something very basic.
Do you mean Pei-mei's food or
Angela's food?
So I've never eaten the food that Angela.
Okay.
I've interviewed her. She hasn't cooked for me, so there's a difference. But I know she teaches cooking classes in Taipei still. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So when you go back to Taiwan, do you find that there's traces of Pei-mei in the cooking, or do you think it's sort of receding a little bit since it's been 40 more years? Yeah.
Yeah, so interestingly, when I started this project, it was around, let's see, when did I start this project? Basically, Pei-mei passed away in 2004. So that was before I ever started this project in 2014 or whatever. I can't remember exactly when. 2007, I guess. I can't remember. Anyway, I went back to Taiwan in 2014, which was the 10th anniversary of her death. And her family was sort of like commemorating her memory by having like special dishes at different restaurants in Taipei. And each restaurant kind of covered a specific set of dishes. And, it was like a Pei-mei, not memorial, but like commemorative restaurant event. And what was fascinating to me at the launch of this event, which I went to with her children and everything like that, was the way that they spoke about her food as kind of, this reminds us of the way our parents used to eat, kind of like a past tense of a Chinese, a way of eating that is no longer the way that people eat and cook Chinese food today. Because of course it changes, there isn't any, as you well know, there is no classic sort of unchanging dish formation. It always changes with tastes and times. And as another young woman whose blog I looked at, she decided to update all of Pei-mei's recipes and kind of use less oil, no MSG, all that stuff. So there's just different ways in which people kind of adapt and use her recipes and things like that. But to me, it was really interesting because for so many second generation Chinese Americans like me, people still are using her cookbooks like it's a living thing for them. But for people in Taiwan, it's like so many other things have happened since then. They see this as her as a sign of kind of the past. So it's a really interesting relationship having to do with how her cookbooks and everything like that.
So can I dig into some politics? I mean, we're talking about Taiwan as a site, and Pei-mei is sort of this immigrant from China after the Communist Revolution, and then also, if you look at the early cookbooks, Taiwanese food is not a part of it, which you note. But also, I've always wondered about, the sort of broadcast. So one of my poetry teacher, actually, his father was part of the re-Sinization campaign in the 1950s. And I've always wondered about, to what extent her sort of, efforts to bring Chinese cuisine to the masses, to have a cookbook, but also a cooking school and a television program was part of that sort of effort to take a population that had lived under Japanese colonialism for 50 years and say, look, hey, this is great Chinese cuisine and it's time to eat and cook Chinese again, and we're going to show you how to do it properly. And I always wondered about her relationship to the regime and whether it's easy thing to get at, from this distance.
Well, I certainly think if it hadn't been her, it would have been somebody else, right? It was a time and a place that was calling out for someone who could be an expert in all of these different regional cuisines. Because as you say, after 1949, all these mainlanders come to Taiwan, like, 1 to 2 million people, and the population on the island is about 6 million at the time. And so it's a huge influx. And all of these people are coming from all over different parts of China and bringing with them all their different ways of eating. So that in Taipei, you're going to have, different kinds of restaurants will begin to emerge, people eating in different ways. And, women are interested, or anyone, not just women, are interested in how their neighbors are eating. So, before, if you lived in China and you lived in Hunan, all you would see is Hunanese food, all you would eat is Hunanese food, and it's Hunanese food all around you. But suddenly in Taipei, you'll see Hunanese food and Sichuanese food and Shandong food and Fujianese food and all different kinds of ways of eating. So people at that time were just curious, right? They're just curious about how their neighbors are eating because, hey, that dish looks pretty good. And, wanting to try these different tastes. And also, as we get into the, post-war period and the building of the economy in Taiwan, people have money. They're more, as they grow and develop their economy, they have more money to spend on eating out. They have more money to spend on buying ingredients and trying new foods, and like not just trying new Chinese foods, but as I talk about in here, like learning how to bake a birthday cake, right? Using ingredients that are not native at all to Chinese, or maybe we would talk about that, but butter, things that you would get at the American military exchange store. They're just learning all these new and different things. So not just how do you cook Chinese food, but, curiosity about Western food. And so it's a real kind of moment of transition, I think, for the ways that people are eating in Taiwan at the time.
Can I ask a question about the relationship between sort of Pei-mei's cooking and then the Grand Hotel? Because, when I was in college, too long ago, I saw Eat Man, Drink Woman, and that was sort of like my sort of, I guess it's like the original Chinese food porn movie, right? I mean, because you have these gorgeous daughters who are attached to the great chef, master chef, and then you've got these luscious scenes of people making and eating food. And that, was what my idea of what food in Taiwan was largely came from that food, but also this idea of gourmet Chinese food in Taiwan, of course. And so I've always, for a long time, I mean, today, of course, people say otherwise, that, the Grand Hotel was considered the apex of the culinary establishment in Taiwan. And so I've always wondered about the relationship between the recipes in her book and the ones. Oh, Eat, Drink, Man, Woman.
Yeah, it's a wonderful film.
Beautiful film. Yeah. So I was curious whether if you could tell us anything about the relationship between her, canonical version of Chinese cuisine and the stuff that was being sold in this amazing hotel.
I'm not sure that, she always fancied herself as really a home cook. And who she wanted to teach were housewives. So she never owned a restaurant. She was never a chef as such, even though people call her a chef. She was really a cooking instructor, a cooking teacher. So I feel like home cooking and, restaurant cooking that they would do at the Grand Hotel, which is like the, top fancy hotel, especially in the early decades of Taiwan after 1949, kind of two different ways of cooking. And although she's very skilled, it's always with the idea of you're feeding your family, you're feeding like the people you love, you're putting some love into the food so that they'll eat it. And your concerns are more getting the food on the table, in time. If you're a working woman, having enough time to cook, for your family before the later revolution of eating in Taipei and Taiwan, where there's so many restaurants, so many ways of eating. At the start, there wasn't all that, right? So if you're going to eat, you're going to have to learn how to cook. If you want to feed your family, you're going to have to learn how to cook. So the relationship with like restaurants and more formal styles of cuisine, I think, really is more just sort of home, just like it's doable. It's not, kind of so complicated or so. Well, if you have some level of skill, I should say. But she isn't she's definitely a figure of the ruling party, right, the Nationalist Party, and she is definitely associated with kind of because you can imagine on television she's showing this picture of an idealized kind of housewife figure, right? She's beautifully dressed. She knows how to cook. her hair is immaculate, she speaks well. So she is projecting a kind of an image of an idealized woman that all these women maybe would like to be, or hope they're, or if you were a kid, what you hoped your mom would be or your grandma would be. And she's speaking in Mandarin and not in dialect, right? This is very important that everybody's speaking Mandarin, and we're not allowing people to speak Taiwanese at the time and stuff like that. But I think it's never a formal relationship. It's kind of an informal relationship but I think probably more than any kind of sense of that political side, I think it's really, for me, her wanting to help women, like it's a weird thing because it's like, is it feminist? No, it seems very retro, seems very like she's cooking, she's domestic, but it's just interesting to me, like all the contradictions that her career kind of contains, which is why I think she's such a compelling figure.
Or contradictions that all of us experience, right? I'm going to go home and do math homework with my kid tonight. So, I mean, I'm very interested in that sort of the tension, because of course you're writing this sort of book at this moment in Taiwan's history where, there's clearly signs that people don't want to be part of China, and China doesn't love that, right? And so you see all the military exercises, and then there's also this effort to sort of like really celebrate Taiwanese culture and food as well. And so I always wonder, where is Pei-mei in that sort of landscape, And so that's, question.
Absolutely. So if I don't know how many of you like to cook, but there's a fantastic new cookbook by Clarissa Wei called Made in Taiwan. It's just won a James Beard Award, I think, and or just other awards and things like that. It's a beautiful cookbook. It's got great pictures, great instructions, great background and stuff in it. And I interviewed Clarissa for my book as well, and she was very clear. From her perspective, she felt like Pei-mei represents the past, kind of that mainlander articulation of what Chinese food is. And she's really explicit about saying Taiwanese food is something different. It's not Chinese food. It's something different. They have a different history, a different past, and therefore a different cuisine. And I agree, there are these distinctions, but I also think, well, it is not unrelated, there is still, unless you're indigenous, like some shared, which there are, indigenous people in Taiwan as well, there is kind of some shared cultural roots, because many of those migrants were, they did come from the mainland, say in the 17th century or something like that, and then had been in Taiwan for many, many centuries. But I can see why people want to articulate that kind of historical narrative, that we are different, we are distinct. But, it's like, people have all kinds of opinions about it, right? There's all kinds of ways that people might slice and dice it. And I think what's interesting too is the meaning of who or what is Taiwanese is obviously changing and different from the 1950s to now for different reasons, asserting different kinds of historical narratives and identities. And I think it's important to think, okay, there's never just been one fixed idea. Obviously, we're both historians, but that these are changing and morphing through time.
Yes, and the number that you brought up, which is like 1 to 2 million people from the mainland pouring in, between 1941 and 1951, that's like, in terms of population history, that's a major demic shift, right? And so, and then a lot of the migrants were, as Derek Kwong's book shows, are very working class people who end up in the food industry. And so, it's something very important happened, or something very big happened very quickly there. And so, it's hard to take even something that people consider traumatic out of the picture, right? It's a part of that story.
And for sure, I think, maybe with economic development and the rise of all these wonderful different regional, like Din Tai Fung, the super popular, super famous, they make their xiaolongbao and like dumplings and things like that. And that's a mainlander established chain, right? But it's spread around the world and spread around the globe. But it's really interesting because I think the attitude towards quote unquote mainlanders cuisines has changed or is changing. And frankly, a lot of the people that were the original restaurant owners are dying or passing on, and do their children want to take over those things? Are the tastes even the same, right? All of these things are going to change, and people will feel differently about the kinds of foods that they're eating. And not to mention Taiwan being, sort of the influx of international cuisines, and like you can get great Japanese sushi, or like all kinds of different openness to, and people again just wanting culinary curiosity and difference. They want something new. No one wants to eat the same old all the time, right? People are always wanting to try new things. So I think all of those things contribute to making Taiwan one of the best places to go and eat, right? There's just so much to try and to, eat and savor. And still some of these really old, when I say really old, like, post 49 established restaurants, or even before that, it's kind of interesting to see all these layers in this really cosmopolitan place.
Well, there's actually even more recent layers, right? I was thinking about some of those shanxi, like they sort of that sandwich, like some of this stuff is even more recent, because relations were closer 20 years ago, and so there were more sort of exchanges, and even people going and getting chefs from Shanghai to open competitors to Din Tai Fung, for example. So yeah, it's an ongoing sort of like relationship that is fraught, but it's definitely a relationship of some kind. So my next question is, I was thinking about a story I heard. So I'm friends with George Lee, the vegan influencer. I guess he's like a vegan chef that is from Taiwan, and then went to Berkeley, and during the pandemic he started shooting like little films about like vegan cooking. Most of my undergrads right now are very anti-vegan. It's quite interesting. But he did this, so he went back to Taiwan, and he has his cook, like I think it's called Agong's Table. And so he tells me the story that on one side of his family, I think it's his mother's side, I think they migrated to the U.S. like a lot of people did in the 70s. But I think the women in the family decided they were going to be part of the restaurant industry once they got to the United States. And so his grandmother enrolled in a class with Pei-mei to prepare for like the sort of business of going to the U.S. and opening a Chinese restaurant. And I've always been interested in the way that the story of Pei-mei is also a story about American Chinese food, because I can't imagine this was like, a one-off strategy.
Yeah. No, it was definitely true that basically a lot of people took, especially in the 70s when lots of people wanted to leave Taiwan because of the uncertain, kind of international political status after Taiwan was sort of summarily ejected from the United Nations. But a lot of people, and the instability of the politics in Taiwan at the time, a lot of people did want to emigrate, and they felt that if they went to Pei-mei's cooking school, they could get a certificate, and that would kind of prove their credentials. And interestingly, I interviewed another a French scholar, Françoise Saban, who also does a lot of Chinese food studies, and she took a cooking class from Pei-mei in the 1970s and in 1979, I think. And she said she was the only foreign student in the class, and every single one of the other Taiwan students in the class wanted to go to America in order to open a Chinese restaurant. So, you would see like all these, when I would look back at American newspapers, a lot of advertisements for restaurants saying, I studied with Pei-mei, like all these ways that people were kind of boasting of that credential because she was so well known, and she was kind of, and not only that, like Americans who would go and study for 6 weeks with Pei-mei and then come back and teach their own Chinese cooking classes. So it's a really interesting way that she really served as the imprimatur of, having learned properly, because she was so, she just was really well known at the time. So I don't think the example that you cite is absolutely not unusual at all. Yeah.
So I mean, just on that, because we're in Ann Arbor, and I always think, how does this matter to Americans? But I also feel like the story of food in Taiwan is actually central to the sort of story of Chinese food in America post 1970, right? Or post 66, because I mean there was an exit ban, so Chinese couldn't leave the mainland until 1979, but actually, in actual fact, it's mid 80s, really, right? And then the big wave comes in the 90s. So that most people are eating Chinese food that comes via Taiwan, probably from Pei-mei, or Hong Kong, or some Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. So I feel like your story in some ways is really central to the formation of what we know today as Chinese American food.
Yeah, and that's the really interesting thing about, we think of Chinese American food as one thing, but obviously it's different diasporic groups that have come to the United States. And as you say, originally, like in the 40s or 50s or 60s, and even into the 1970s, all the restaurants you would have gone to are owned by someone from Hong Kong, someone from Taiwan, maybe someone from Singapore or Southeast Asia or something like that. But it really isn't until starting in the 1980s, I think, that we get a much larger number of people coming from mainland China. And now, probably all the Chinese restaurants, the ordinary kind of Chinese restaurants, unless they claim to have some other background, dollars to donuts, the person, owning the restaurant and working there is from Fujianese, and not, no longer from Hong Kong or Taiwan. As those people age again and move out, the interesting thing is a lot of their children, they don't want their kids to, they worked hard in the restaurant so their kids can go to U of M. They don't want them to own a restaurant and work like a dog and, never get a day off. And so, like, the movement out for second generation for some people is a sign of success, right? So then all these newcomers from mainland China have the same patterns, may not speak that, English that well, don't have other ways of kind of making a living, and so go into the restaurant industry. So interestingly, it's the Fujianese who have really kind of like made inroads and networks and all kinds of ways of kind of capturing a majority of the, and it's different in every country. That's the fascinating thing. In the US, it's Fujianese. In Italy, it's people for Winzo. It's like all these local networks that become the kind of the local migrants where they go to and stuff like that. But another interesting twist on that, I think, is with Asian Americans is like a lot of second gen kids whose parents owned a Chinese restaurant of some kind, like, come back to it. And they're like, oh, but they come back to it not just with the food skills, but also the cultural knowledge and the cultural capital to know how to market the restaurant to young people. Like, I'm thinking of Xi'an Famous Foods or something like that, right? Where the father is from Xi'an and making all these great noodles, and the son is going to take that to like the web, or take that to hipsters, or take that to the world, And so that's really interesting to me, how a new generation of entrepreneurs, Asian American entrepreneurs, are really kind of taking on like, what their parents knew through hard work, and expanding it to broader audiences that are beyond a specific diasporic group, which I think is really, really interesting.
So can I just go back to the sort of, the fact that we know the Chinese food that most Americans know, and I'm thinking like when we were growing up, or, even the stuff we have today at some level is a descendant of that 1980s sort of menu or 70s menu. But, often, when we read sort of standard histories of Chinese food in America, right, where there's this sort of moment where you had the garbage chop suey in the early 20th century, and then in 1966 there's this sort of revolution in Chinese food in America, and all of a sudden we've discovered the real thing, because now we've got a new stock of immigrants and they're cooking for themselves and it's better, and they're real chefs, not coal miners, as the story goes. But what I've been interested in is thinking about the fact that even if you're a mainlander that comes through Taiwan or Hong Kong and spends 10, 12, 13 years and then open a restaurant in America, are you actually, the stuff you're cooking in America, is that exactly as it was in China, or did something happen to your palate, to your cooking skills in Taiwan? Because I've always wondered if, this is not just a pass-through for Chinese culture, but maybe sort of a generative space at some level.
Well, I think it also speaks to just like, in my classes on food, I'm sure in your classes that relate to food, we are always talking about authenticity, the big A word, like what is authentic? Is it authentic? Does it exist? And so I always encourage my students to think about, if it's authentic, for whom and for what and why? Why does this matter to us as a concept or an idea, right? And obviously food is constantly changing and morphing. So the idea of, is it exactly like people in China ate? I mean, the way people in China eat has also not stayed the same, right? That has also transformed and adapted and emerged to new trends, new ingredients, new, fads or whatever.
Taiwanese influence.
Yeah, so I feel like the mistake is to think that food ever is only one thing, and it always stays like that for 1,000 years or 5,000 years or whatever. In fact, it's constantly, that's why it's an exciting topic, is because you can't put it in a box. It never stays there, right? It is always changing, moving with people, moving with times, moving with trends. And I think the interesting thing for me today is, like, as you mentioned before, is the advent of new ways of learning. Like, my students learn how to cook on TikTok. They don't even use a book anymore, right? They don't use a cookbook. They're using all these different modes and ways of learning, which I think is different. You know, and in a way, one of the really neat things about Pei-mei and her story is that at that moment in time, it was the only way to learn that people were learning. Her cookbook is so iconic because everyone in that generation was using this very same cookbook, right? And nowadays it's like there's 5 bajillion ways to learn how to cook Chinese food. I can name 10 websites off the top of my head, which, by the way, if anyone is asking, like people always ask me, I love the Woks of Life, WOKS. It's a great Chinese cooking website that's run by a family, two adult daughters and their parents, and it's a really lovely story. But they have great recipes that work. So, and I can manage to do them within my busy schedule. But I think today, in just thinking about what is Chinese food, my God, there's like, 5 million inputs of how to cook, what you could do, and I think a lot of it is just simply, nowadays people talking about the way they particularly eat, right? This is my Hong Kong grandfather, or this is my Wenzhou, kind of background or whatever. And that's really interesting and exciting. But it's also kind of overwhelming. But I think that really changes the way we even think about food, because there's so many different ways of learning about what it is, not just one woman's cookbook, and not just cookbooks, but the whole wash of what the digital world can bring to us.
How are we on time?
I think that we're okay. Maybe one more question from you, and then we can open it to...
I don't want to monopolize. So I was thinking about, can we go back to the U.S., since I'm always trying to justify everything, right? Especially at this moment where everything is America first. So, I was thinking that if people really in Taiwan learned to cook Chinese food through Pei-mei, and then were one of the main conduits for what we think of as Mandarin food or Sichuan or Hunan, is it fair to say that maybe at some level Pei-mei is the mother of, or helped standardize or gave up, because Chinese food is an amorphous concept, but then it becomes very concrete. You get standard recipes, you have standard offerings. And, maybe one of the complaints you often see actually about Chinese food in America is it's a little too standardized and a little predictable. But I'm very interested in that process of creating, these canonical recipes, and then even a sense of what they should taste like. And whether, her sort of popularity, her cookbook, her television show in some ways played a large role in that sort of creating of a sort of culinary canon.
Yeah, that's really an interesting question, which I hadn't really thought about. But I think that even for someone like Pei-mei, she was never like, stick to the recipe. It was always, do it to your taste. You don't like it, don't put it in there. You don't want to do it this way, you don't have that ingredient, put something else in. Like, one of the capacities I feel like of Chinese cuisine in general is that people are really creative and just do what they have with what they have on hand. They go to a different country, fine, they use what they can find in that local place. And so I feel like there's a way that it escapes the canonization, because I can find 50,000 ways of making jiachang tofu, with like home-style tofu, whatever. Your home is different from mine. So our jiachang tofu is not going to taste the same. So I feel like, even though she's teaching women how to cook, there was never, I don't think, not in the same way, I don't think that you would think of like, oh, this is Julia Child's beef bourguignon recipe or something like that. I just feel like there's always kind of an adaptive part to it. Oh, you don't have this fish? Fine, use this one. You don't have this? Use that, and a kind of a way that, is there, it's always walking two sides, because she did also say there's a correct way to cook things, there's an authentic way to cook things. She said it herself, but I feel like that understanding of what that could be. Right, and when I talk about my students, I'm always like, well, instead of using the word authenticity, do you like it? Do you think it's good? Like that might be a better, it moves with you, right? What you think of as good might change too. So, yeah, that's how I would think about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for such a lovely conversation. We're going to take some questions. So we are recording and live streaming this evening. So I am going to ask, nay, insist, that all questions are spoken into the mic, so that way people who are watching at home can hear the questions that are being asked. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then I'll just run around the room and bring you the mic, and you can ask your question. All right.
Hello, thank you very much. Professor Brown mentioned American first, so these days. So would Professor King mention the origin of the famous Taiwanese beef noodle soup in your book?
Sure. So, beef noodle soup is one of those iconic dishes. Somebody yesterday asked me, "What is the national dish of Taiwan?" I'm like, "You don't need to pick one. There's like, you can, why pick one when the whole table is filled?" But she forced me to pick one. So I said, well, if you forced me to pick one, then I would say beef noodle soup, just because it's the one thing like I mean, there isn't one. There just, I feel national dish is a mistaken notion. You would just be cutting out all these other wonderful, delicious things. So beef noodle soup is just kind of a braised beef over noodles with soup, obviously, and some greens or something like that. Again, it's made 5,000 ways. You can find different ways to eat it and try it. And the way the origin story of beef noodle soup is that kind of demobilized soldiers who came to Taiwan with the Nationalist Party lived in specific military villages with their families. And a lot of them came from other parts of China, and then in order to support themselves had to go and make food, or sold food on the streets or whatever. And that beef noodle soup kind of comes out of those military villages, and those are the people that started selling, because it's originally, has Sichuan roots and stuff like that. But it really does become and take on a life of its own. So if you go to Taiwan and you go to a tourist shop, like you can find every kind of iconic little food thing to sell in the souvenir stores, and beef noodle soup and bubble tea and, baozi and whatever. You'll see all these. It's one of the many iconic foodstuffs of Taiwan. But that's what I would say as far as the. You're shaking your head. You say, no, that's not how it starts. Oh.
You mentioned
Right,
the
right.
source of the beef, because
Right.
Taiwanese farmers don't eat beef.
Yeah.
So I was so surprised to learn that the Taiwanese beef noodle soup is the Taiwanese dish. But in your book, you taught me where the beef is from.
Is that so? It is interesting that a lot of those, I wouldn't say that's the only input, but definitely the post-war, Cold War period in Taiwan, the Americans do have kind of a presence, definitely have a large presence in Taiwan when they were still sending military aid and military advisors to Taiwan. And definitely like wheat was imported from the United States. And there are a lot of these inputs that were, but I would not say it would be very, very wrong to say that the Americans were the ones that brought beef noodles to Taiwan. I don't think that's true. But, right, yep, there is that added interesting input of like the import of wheat, which is the basis of the wheat noodles that people would eat.
Oh, excuse me.
It's possible little bit when you was talking, I was thinking, teaching fun Pei-mei, teach women. But when I live in Shanghai, men mostly cooking at home. For that, I asking why culturally was teaching women.
That's a really great question. So one of the things is that, a lot of kind of upper class or educated families, you would have a cook. You don't cook yourself if you're the woman. You have a servant do it for you. But as part of the process of moving to Taiwan in 1949 is that whole like class of people is left behind. And it's the wealthier elite people that are moving to Taiwan, right? For the most part, the soldiers would be a slightly different story. But those people, when they come to Taiwan, if you want to get a housemaid to help you cook, she's going to be from Taiwan. She's not going to be from your hometown, from your home place, because those women didn't have the money. If you were unattached and unmarried, you're not going to move to Taiwan. You're going to stay in your local place. So the people that come, you know, the only housemates they can get are from Taiwan, and they don't know how to cook your dish from Sichuan, your dish from Shanghai, your dish from Jiangsu or whatever. So therefore, if you want to eat that, you better learn to cook it for yourself, right? You better learn how to make those tastes for yourself. So that's part of the reason why, like, and also just like the large households of the Chinese past really over time and modernization become a nuclear household with not an extensive army of servants to serve your every whim. Right now, you're the housewife, you're it, you know, or maybe you have one kitchen maid, but she doesn't know how to cook the dishes you want to eat. So if you want those, you're going to have to cook those. So there is that shift as well that's happening in post-war Taiwan. So that's a very good question, yeah.
Good evening. Yan-Ling Van Meister here. I want to thank you both for a very enlightening evening tonight. I do have a few points to share or comment. So many people in my generation moving from Taiwan to here, we actually learn to cook at home, be it our mother, our father, or our chef or cook at home. We may not be cooking a lot or in Taiwan, but we did get a chance to observe. So, like in my case, I often work as a sous chef next to my mother. I never really cooked in Taiwan. Cooking really started after I came here. Oh, if I want to eat this, can't find it in a restaurant, what do I do? But I did watch a lot of food Pei-mei shows in Taiwan. And that's also another inspiration. So in my opinion, I felt Pei-mei was not just a TV character, a first TV character teaching cooking, but really she's the pioneer introducing cooking of all styles that includes Taiwanese dishes to the whole island through the live TV presentations. Because back in the days, transportation was not very convenient. Restaurants are there, but not everybody can afford. So Pei-mei was really the first one to do that, to make it accessible for people. And we glue our eyes to the TV screen when she's on. So, and then another point is home cooking definitely has changed in Taiwan. More and more people, or less people cook, and more people will do the order for the pre-made dishes, especially for holidays. So it's a very competitive market in Taiwan especially. I use my sister as an example. She gave me 4 or 5 different companies she ordered the food from for the Chinese New Year. But one of them was from the Pei-mei Cooking Institute. So that's very encouraging. No, it's all island. They can just do the express delivery. So based on this consumer-oriented market, it is a very competitive market. And I think the cooking, therefore, is definitely changed, especially for the more complicated dishes, like fo tiao chang. Who cooks fo tiao chang at home? I do, because I couldn't really find another one elsewhere, right? So, and for myself, I have all 3 hard copies of Pei-mei's cookbook.
You got to save those because they're worth something now.
Plus the cards.
From 40 plus years ago. Yep. In addition, I also have the recipe cards that have been divided into categories in their own separate sleeves. These are treasure. I have arranged these recipe cards over and over years to cook my banquets.
They are scratch and sniff.
So I
And
would
they're
say
stained.
it's definitely true that, like, in the United States as well, people don't cook as much as they enjoy watching and learning about food, probably. Like, right, the number of people that are home cooking obviously has dramatically dropped as women have gone into the workforce. People are busy. Like in my own life, it's an irony that I write a book about a cookbook author and have very little time to cook myself, you know? So we eat a lot of like fried rice is my go-to dish for my kids. But I definitely think that home cooking, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, it's like a mixed bag, right? Because I want women to be able to go into the workforce. I don't want the entire burden and labor of home cooking to fall on women's shoulders. I think it should fall on everyone's shoulders. But I do also lament because it's like, you know, there's something like when somebody cooks you a beautiful meal or even just puts a little love into it, and maybe it's even not that good, but they made it for you and they put some love into it. Like that's something to me that cannot be replaced with no matter what meal you would buy for someone. And that's something like my aunt, she's someone I interview in my book as well. She lives in Malaysia. She used, you know, Pei-mei's cookbooks to start cooking. And she was like, you know, if you gotta cook for your, you know, so it's like it's a double-edged sword because I recognize that. I don't want to put that burden on anyone who doesn't want that burden, but I also recognize, since I have myself been nourished in those ways, that that's how I show my love, you know, for my own kids and stuff like that, is cooking for them.
I think of it, if love is doing math problems, that's...
Hi, my name is Stacy He. I'm from Bloomfield Hills. I have a question. I think Pei-mei, also Taiwan, loves stir fried dishes. Do you think the Michelin rating system is suitable for evaluating Taiwanese food? Taiwanese stir fry culture values fresh ingredients, fast cooking, and lively dining atmosphere, which differ from Michelin.
Yeah, that's been a huge contentious issue, not just for restaurants in Taiwan, but restaurants pretty much anywhere outside of France, right? Or maybe outside of Europe. Are the Michelin, you know, whatever judges qualified to judge what is good Chinese food or what is not, or in Taiwan or in Taiwanese food or anything. And I think about this because my kids and I love to watch a Great British Baking Show. And so whenever like Paul Hollywood is talking about some Asian bread or something like that, I'm like, I don't know what he knows about this. Like, how would he know? But it's been a contentious issue for the Michelin rating system. And I think as a result, there's numerous other like local rating systems that have come in, or, you know, other alternative designations and things like that. I know the world's best 50 restaurants or top 50 restaurants, that's a huge accolade now. They all have local committees that would vote and local people that would kind of make those decisions and stuff. But in the end of the day, all of the rating systems all are kind of a boon to the business, right? It's like the Oscars. The main purpose of it is to get people to watch those movies. So, you know, I think, you know, are they qualified? I don't know, but they're out there amongst other kinds of rating systems. And, you know, my own thing is like, go look to see who is the line out the door, then probably it's a restaurant you want to eat in. If there's nobody in there, you probably don't want to go in there either. That's my own rating system.
Hello. I've been a fan. I've lived in Taiwan. My wife sits next to me here. We do have the Pei-mei set, 3 volumes. A few years ago, I assembled the same set for dear friends for somewhere under $10 a copy. Now they're over 100. So that's one thing. I don't think they're being republished, but it would be great.
Yeah, so, you know, interestingly, so Pei-mei's daughter is the one who has a cooking school or still teaches cooking classes in Taiwan. but her son is the one that kind of took over the publishing enterprise. And in Taiwan, they actually have republished her cookbooks and reissued them under a new cover with new photos. I'm not sure if they've updated the recipes. They may have changed the recipes as well. So you can get those updated ones.
And those are 双语言, right?
Yes, I believe
Bilingual.
so. I believe
Okay.
so, yeah. But I don't think they're the same, they don't have the same aura, if you will, right, as the original cookbooks from the 1960s and 70s. For some reason, you know, nobody's like wanting to buy those for $100 or more, like I see sometimes on used bookstores.
But
Yeah.
then my other question is, you've got Wei Quan as a fast follower.
Right.
And then there's also Cecilia Jiang, who just passed away a few years ago, with that great video about her. I mean, she was a Shanghainese, came through Japan to San Francisco and set up a restaurant that I think, on the West Coast at least, transformed an understanding of Chinese cooking. Do you ever look into that as well?
Yeah, so she is one of those iconic figures that most Americans probably know about. Cecilia Chang, and also Joyce Chen would be another one of those figures who had her restaurant empire in the Boston area. And so those, or Buwei Yangchao is another early figure from the 1940s women who moved here from China, you know, even from other parts of China, not even Taiwan, before or around 1949, or, you know, and they had a major presence. And so a lot of Americans know of those women. And so it was important to me to introduce Americans to Pei-mei because they don't know her, right? Unless you have some familiarity with Taiwan, your parents somehow have the cookbooks or something like that. So that's why it was important to me that people, I love the idea that the cookbook could represent that trans-Pacific journey. Like, that's really important to me. And in a way that Cecilia Chang and Joyce Chen, they were first and foremost entrepreneurs because they were restaurant owners. You know, their first thing wasn't to teach women how to cook, right? And that was always Pei-mei's thing from the get-go. She never had a restaurant. She wasn't interested in owning a restaurant. She was interested in teaching women how to cook. So there is that big difference and distinction, yeah.
So thank you so much again. I would like to, you mentioned something about the second generation expanding their parents' skills. So we have an example here in Ann Arbor. Sweet Waters is a franchise selling coffee, competing with Starbucks with 40 franchises in 12 states. So if you want to write about the second generation food, Chinese food, that may be your next endeavor. And I don't mean to harp on this noodle soup. I thought
You're just making everyone hungry by talking about noodle soup. We're all like thinking about it and wanting to eat it.
I thought I read that the beef is from the U.S. aid in cans. Because we didn't have beef, and so the beef was from the United States, and the soldiers had to dilute the beef into a big soup so more people can have something to eat. And the afterlife is that since it's so famous, some entrepreneur went to Shanghai when China was open to establish a noodle soup, and he cannot say it's a Taiwanese beef noodle soup. So he called it California beef noodle soup.
That's a clever
and
entrepreneur.
It was very
yes.
popular, and I was told when Chinese had means to travel to the United States, they were very disappointed in California. They couldn't find any California beef noodle soup.
That's really funny.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the other thing is that I still want to talk about American first, okay? Because you have in the index American military wives.
Yes.
And they are very influential because they taught their cooks at home how to cook how to bake cakes. And these people set up shops in pastries in Taiwan. And that's how they changed the scenery.
Yeah, there was I think it was I can't remember if it was in her autobiography or somewhere else, that Pei-mei said that so one of the early guests she had on her program in 1962 actually was an American military wife who demonstrated how to make banana bread on television. And that was the first time anyone had ever seen anybody making banana bread, whatever. Banana bread's like the basic lowest level of baking, right? That's the first thing you learn how to make. But for people in Taiwan who did not have ovens in their homes, right, you had to buy a separate little thing. We would call it a toaster oven, but an oven is not a given accessory in a Chinese kitchen. Most people would go buy their baked goods from a bakery. You don't bake them at home. And so, there's like, this whole industry that develops like, oh, you want to bake? Then here's all these things you'll need: a whisk, measuring cups, like all of these things that were not sort of endemic to a Chinese kitchen. And so Pei-mei said, or claimed, I don't know if it's true, I could not verify, that after the banana bread episode with this American military wife demonstrating it in 1962, that there was like this huge demand for bakery and baked goods, and like it just spread all the interest in American baking. And of course, there were things that people, like birthday cakes, again, foreign concept, that you would celebrate your kid's birthday and that you'd make a big deal about it, and that you'd use a birthday cake with frosting made from buttercream, right? All these different things were kind of also a demonstration of how modern people were eating. Like modern foodways meant both the different regional cuisines of China and the Western baking. They didn't care about Western food so much. That they could take or leave. But it was the baked goods that a lot of Chinese were like, oh, they know how to make baked sweets. Like, I don't know about the main dishes, but we'll take the sweets. So.
Hi, I'm just curious, in your research of writing this book, did you find out about Pei-mei? I mean, just thinking about it back, it never occurred to me that how did she learn how all the Chinese food from different provinces when she was growing up and left early to Taiwan when she was not even 20 probably. How did she even know all those dishes that came from different places that she had never experienced? Yeah. Especially she's from a part of China where she was born that's not famous for any food up north, right? So I'm just curious.
So you gotta be careful, those are fighting words. Right, no, it's absolutely true that she did not know how to cook when she migrated to Taiwan. In fact, when she first got married, she was a terrible cook, and her husband would berate her for how bad her cooking was, and he'd be like, why can't you make better? She just didn't know how. And she basically said that because he would yell at her so much, especially when he brought over his friends to play mahjong, and she would cook for them and it was really bad. He was like, loss of face. He felt it was embarrassing. So because of that impetus, basically she hired restaurant chefs to come and teach her their specialty dishes. And she used her dowry, she sold her jewelry in order to take these cooking classes. They weren't cooking classes, it was just her hiring restaurant chefs, one from Sichuan, one from Hunan, another from Beijing or whatever. And that's how she learned all the different kinds of regional specialties, was this hiring of different chefs. Because at the time there weren't other ways for her to learn. This was in the 50s. So that's why that really became her claim to fame when she went on television in Taiwan, was I have studied with chefs from all over China, and I can tell you the rudiments of how to make basic dishes from all these different regions. So that was part of the learning curve that she herself, she wasn't at all home trained. She was a lousy cook, and then became this, made a career out of cooking, which I think gives hope to all of us who are not very good cooks, right? It's just a matter of patience and practice and, willing subjects to eat the food that you make, so.
You just have to put in more love.
Right. We've got a question over here.
Well, actually, more of the comments, because, talking all these food make us all inspired about having a next events. Hopefully that, Meantime will have beef noodle soup, as well as maybe having a chef coming over to in our district library again. Maybe have Professor Miranda here with us again, because we did that in 2019, and after that COVID hit and everybody stopped what we are doing. But I guess it's time to resume it, especially Professor King had a great book, and we started with the Pei-mei's talk, first one, and hopefully we'll have a series 2 and 3 and 4.
Well, I think if you bring food in, people will come. So
I'm sure that will happen. Just a comment. Thank you so much for today.
I think if we probably have time for one more question, and then I want to get the book signing started. 1 second.
You ran a lap around the. Anyway, Fuchsia Dunlop. Fuchsia Dunlop, Cambridge scholar, who spent a year in Sichuan and went to a cooking school and earned the, I guess it's called Arji Chushi, the second level chef certificate from studying there, and has written some marvelous books. Where does she fit into this panoply?
with the other 5 billion inputs of how to learn Chinese food, right? She's a very popular, she's probably the best known Chinese cookbook author writing in English, I would say these days. But there are lots and lots of cookbook authors, and that's just the beauty of it. Like, there's so many. There isn't any one iconic author anymore that could lay claim to the entire generation of cooking, because now people just know so much about where all the different food is coming from. But definitely her cookbooks are very popular. She does tours in China. You know, she writes, I think she sometimes has I don't know if she still has a column in The Guardian or whatever. Yeah, one of many just really talented cookbook authors that are out there now who are teaching about Chinese cuisine.
All right, well, let's give our presenters a hand for a wonderful talk. So our friends at Book Suite are still out in the vestibule area if you want to pick up a copy of the book, and then I am going to run and go get a small table, and Michelle will sit here and sign. So thank you all so much for coming out tonight.